My wife was having sex with her lover while we planned a hike. I caught everything on tape, and she thought she'd take half of our property, but her plan failed It all started a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I had been planning a big hiking trip in the mountains for months. You know, one of those weekend getaways where you leave behind work, stress, and just breathe the fresh mountain air. I was excited. We hadn't had quality time together in a while, and I thought it would be a great way to reconnect. We'd been a little distant lately, probably just life getting in the way, or so I thought. 2 days before the trip, something shifted in my gut. Call it intuition, paranoia, or whatever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had been spending a lot more time out, supposedly with her friends or staying late at work. Nothing too suspicious on the surface, but it was like I could feel her pulling away emotionally. That's when I decided to test a theory. It wasn't something I ever imagined doing, but I bought a small audio recording device online a while back. I told myself it was for security, but deep down, I think I already knew why I bought it. It had just been sitting there, collecting dust, until that day when I finally pulled it out. I placed it discreetly under the passenger seat of her car, just before she left to run some errands. At that point, I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or even if I'd hear anything at all. Maybe I was just overthinking everything. The guilt of snooping weighed heavy on me. But by the end of that day, when she came back acting like nothing was wrong, I had to know. When she went to bed, I retrieved the device and listened. What I heard next, man, it broke me. I sat in my garage, headphones on, hands trembling. My stomach was in knots, heart racing as I hit play on the recording. At first, there was just the sound of the car engine starting up, her humming to herself, and then silence for a few minutes as she drove. I almost convinced myself I had gone crazy. Maybe this was all just in my head. But then, about 20 minutes in, I heard her phone buzz, and that's when things started unraveling. She answered, her tone shifting immediately, becoming soft, playful in a way I hadn't heard in years. It was like she was talking to someone she was trying to impress. The man on the other end, I couldn't hear him clearly, but the things she was saying, the giggling, the flirting, it all became too real too fast. They weren't just making small talk. They were planning to meet up. She mentioned a hotel. My blood ran cold. I felt like I had been hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. There was no mistaking what was happening. Then it got worse. They started talking about their last meetup, how amazing it had been, how much they missed each other. She said things to him I hadn't heard her say to me in years. I was frozen, numb. My wife, the woman I had spent nearly a decade building a life with, was cheating on me. And not just emotionally, it was physical, and it had been going on for who knows how long. I could feel my breath get shallow, like I was drowning. I ripped the headphones off and threw them on the workbench, trying to breathe through the rage and disbelief. I wanted to yell, break something, wake her up, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the floor, trying to process what I had just heard. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the calm rhythm of her breathing, the very sound that once comforted me now making my skin crawl. How long had she been doing this? Who was this guy? I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do. The next morning, I woke up early and left the house before she did. I needed space to think, needed to calm down before I made any rash decisions. I drove aimlessly, replaying the recording in my head, the words she said to him, the way she laughed. It made me sick. I found myself at a diner, sipping on bitter coffee, staring blankly at the table. The waitress came by a few times to refill my cup, probably wondering why I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I thought about calling my best friend or my brother, anyone who might give me some clarity, but what was I supposed to say? Hey, I just found out my wife's been sleeping with another guy. Any advice? After hours of sitting there, I knew one thing for certain. I needed proof. More than that one recording. If this thing went the way I thought it would, and if it came down to a divorce, I needed solid evidence, not just my word against hers. She wasn't going to get away with half of everything we built together because she wanted to play house with someone else. I made up my mind. I was going to follow her, track her movements, gather everything I could. The device in her car wasn't enough. I needed to know more. After leaving the diner, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. It was time to go all in, no matter how much it hurt. I decided to pick up some basic surveillance gear. Nothing too crazy, just enough to confirm what I had already heard and to paint a clearer picture of what she'd been up to behind my back. I went to a local electronics store and bought a couple more recording devices, a small GPS tracker, and a cheap spy camera. I felt sick just buying this stuff, but I knew it was necessary. I wasn't going to confront her without concrete proof. The rest of that day, I acted normal. I didn't let on that I knew anything. I kissed her goodbye as she left for work the next morning, though it felt like I was kissing a stranger. The plan was simple. I'd install the GPS on her car and keep one of the recording devices hidden in her purse. The camera I'd place somewhere in our bedroom just in case she was bold enough to bring him there. I had no idea how long this had been going on or how many times she had met up with him. I had to assume the worst. My hands shook as I slipped the GPS under her car when she went inside the house that night. It was small and discreet. There was no way she'd find it. I planted the audio recorder in her purse the next morning, right before she left for work. After that, all I could do was wait. The first day passed without much happening. I was glued to my phone, watching the little dot on the map that represented her car. She went to work like usual and came straight home. Nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe she sensed something, or maybe I was just wrong. Maybe this was all just one big misunderstanding, and I'd end up looking like the paranoid husband. But then, the next day, something happened. Around 4 p.m., I saw the dot on my screen move somewhere it shouldn't. It wasn't her work, and it wasn't anywhere near home. It was a hotel. The same hotel they had mentioned on the recording. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her car sit there for the next 3 hours. I didn't want to imagine what was happening inside, but I knew. I knew all too well. I considered driving over there, storming into the hotel, and catching them in the act. The thought crossed my mind more than once, but I stopped myself. I needed to stay calm, stay smart. If I went off the rails now, I'd lose the upper hand. So I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for her to leave. When she finally did, she came home acting like everything was perfectly normal. She smiled at me, asked how my day was, and went on about some boring story from work, completely unaware that I knew her dirty little secret. I felt like I was living in a bad dream, but I couldn't let it show. I played along. Later that night, I retrieved the audio recorder from her purse. I didn't listen to it until she was asleep. The next part I'll never forget. They had recorded everything. It was like they wanted me to hear it. The things they said to each other, the way she talked to him, it was like I was nothing to her. The woman I thought I knew was gone. All that was left was this stranger who had no problem betraying me. She was deep in it with this guy. It wasn't just some one-night fling. This was a full-blown affair. And worst of all, they talked about the upcoming hike, the one I had been so excited about. She laughed, saying how she'd have to pretend everything was fine, how I was clueless. The guy asked if she'd come see him after our trip, and she agreed like it was nothing. I felt my blood boil. That was it. There was no saving this marriage. But I wasn't going to let her walk away with everything. She was about to learn what real betrayal felt like. But I still needed more. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I? Everything was swirling around in my head. The hotel, the lies, the way she mocked me behind my back. Part of me wanted to blow up right then, to throw all the evidence in her face and kick her out of the house. But that wouldn't have gotten me anywhere. I needed to think bigger. I knew I needed more than just audio recordings if I wanted to protect myself in the divorce. Property, savings, retirement, it was all on the line. If she thought she could waltz out of this with half of everything, she had another thing coming. I had to be smart, cold, calculated. It wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. It was about making sure she didn't screw me over after I confronted her. The next few days were a balancing act. I was keeping tabs on her every move, tracking her car, listening to her conversations, while pretending everything was normal at home. She didn't suspect a thing. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than usual, probably because she thought she had me completely fooled. During the day, while she was at work, I started preparing for what was to come. I met with a lawyer, a good one. I told him everything, showed him what I had so far, the audio recordings, the GPS data, everything. He didn't seem surprised. Apparently, he'd seen it all before. But he did give me some solid advice. He told me I was doing the right thing by gathering proof, but that I needed to dig deeper, especially when it came to our finances. That's when I started looking through our bank statements and credit card bills. At first, nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. Groceries, utilities, normal stuff. But after combing through everything, I started noticing some strange charges. Hotel stays that didn't line up with any business trips, dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, and some cash withdrawals she had never mentioned. Little by little, I pieced it together. She had been funding her affair right under my nose. It wasn't just the financial betrayal that got to me. It was the sheer audacity of it all. She had used our joint account to pay for hotel rooms and dinners with this guy. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It was all right there, plain as day. By the end of the week, I felt like I had a clear picture of how deep her lies went. She'd been seeing this guy for at least 6 months, probably longer. It wasn't just a fling, it was a whole other life she was leading behind my back. And yet, every night, she came home and acted like nothing was wrong. I felt like I was living in a parallel universe, watching my own life from the outside. The woman I'd built a life with, planned a future with, was nothing but a liar. And she didn't even seem to feel guilty about it. But I wasn't done yet. I needed one final piece to complete the puzzle. I had been saving the camera for the right moment, and I knew I had to be strategic about it. If she was bold enough to bring him into our home, I'd have the undeniable proof I needed to break this thing wide open. So I set up the camera in the bedroom, tucked it neatly out of sight. I felt disgusting doing it, but I had no choice. I wasn't going to let her walk away without facing the consequences. I was going to know everything, no matter how much it hurt. I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't be long before she gave me exactly what I was looking for. The next day, after discovering the video, I knew I had to move fast. The hike was coming up, just 1 day away now, and I couldn't afford to lose control of the situation. That video had shaken me to my core, but it also gave me something invaluable, undeniable proof. I had what I needed to destroy any chance she had of getting away with this, and now it was just a matter of timing. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, watching her move around the house like nothing was wrong. She was humming a tune, checking our gear, and going over the plans for the hike like this was any other weekend. It made me sick to see how easily she lived this double life. The lies, the deceit, all of it hidden behind that casual smile she wore like armor. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not here. Not without everything in place. The lawyer had already prepped the divorce papers, and we had an airtight plan. It was essential that I play the part of the loving, oblivious husband just a little longer. I had to set the trap properly, make sure every piece was in order. We left the house later that afternoon, packed up the car, and headed for the mountains. The drive was eerily quiet, and I struggled to stay calm, rehearsing in my head how the next few days would play out. She thought we were heading into a peaceful weekend, but all I could think about was what was waiting for us when we got back. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks. The cabin was perfect, small, remote, everything we'd talked about when we planned this trip months ago. At the time, I'd been excited for this. I'd looked forward to being alone with her, thinking it was exactly what our marriage needed. How wrong I'd been. After unloading the car, she suggested we take a short hike before dinner to get in the spirit of things. I agreed, though I wasn't really there. My mind was racing, thinking about the evidence I'd collected, the betrayal, the lies. We walked in silence for most of the trail, just the sound of our boots crunching against the dirt. She seemed at ease, as if this was any other day, but I was counting down the hours. That night, we ate dinner by the fireplace, just the two of us. She kept trying to make small talk, reminiscing about past hikes, our early days together, but all I could see was the woman from that video, the woman who had brought another man into our bed. It took everything in me not to explode, but I kept my composure. This was the final stretch. I had to make it through one more night. The next morning, we woke up early to hit the big trail. This was it, the centerpiece of the trip, the hike we'd both been looking forward to. Or at least I had. Now, it felt like a march to the end of something. We packed our gear and set out just after sunrise, the air still cool, the sky a soft blue. I didn't say much during the hike. She tried to engage me a few times, but I was distant, keeping my responses short. The hike itself was beautiful, the kind of place that should have been a memory we'd cherish forever. But for me, it was just a backdrop to the storm that was brewing inside. By the time we reached the peak, I had made my decision. This trip was the last act in a marriage that had already ended, even if she didn't know it yet. As we stood there, overlooking the valley below, she reached for my hand and smiled. I forced myself to return the gesture, but inside, I was already gone. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was the man she had betrayed, the man who was about to take back control of his life. I wasn't going to confront her out here, though. No, that would come later, back home, where everything was in place, where I had the advantage. We finished the hike and returned to the cabin that evening, tired but quiet. She looked happy, content. She had no idea what was coming, but I did. The end was near. The days leading up to the trip were brutal. Every time she smiled at me, every time she made small talk about the hike, it felt like a punch to the gut. But I had to stay calm, had to keep it together. There was too much on the line now. I had all the evidence I needed, but timing was everything. I didn't just want to catch her, I wanted to make sure she had no way out, no way to walk away with half of everything we had worked for. We left for the hike early Saturday morning. I could see the excitement in her eyes, the way she packed our gear, and talked about the trails like nothing was wrong. I wondered how she could be so comfortable, knowing what she was doing behind my back. Maybe she thought she had me fooled, or maybe she didn't care at all. Either way, I was done playing the role of the oblivious husband. This trip was about more than just fresh air and mountain views. It was the last act of a life I no longer recognized. The drive up was quiet. She tried to make conversation, talking about the weather, the trail conditions, but I barely responded. I told her I was just tired, that work had been rough the past week. She bought it, or at least pretended to. Maybe she was already thinking about how she'd meet up with him after we got back. Who knows? We arrived at the cabin we rented near the trailhead around noon. It was a cozy place, just a small, rustic cabin with a view of the mountains. Normally, I would have been excited to be out in nature, away from everything, but this time was different. Everything felt fake. We unpacked our gear, made some small talk, and then she suggested we go for a short hike that afternoon to warm up before tackling the bigger trail the next day. I agreed, but my mind was somewhere else. I was already thinking ahead to what I was going to do when we got back home. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. Every step on that trail felt heavy, like I was walking further away from the life I used to know and closer to the confrontation that was looming. As we hiked, I noticed little things about her. She was cheerful, maybe even a little too cheerful. It was like she didn't have a care in the world. I wondered how she could act so normal, so happy, knowing the lies she'd been living. I tried to look at her the way I used to remember the woman I fell in love with, but all I saw was a stranger, someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. We reached the top of a ridge that overlooked the valley below, and she stood there, taking it all in, smiling like it was the perfect day. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that I knew everything. But then I remembered the video, the recording, the way she laughed with him, and all the sympathy vanished. That night, back at the cabin, we made dinner and sat by the fire. She kept talking about how nice it was to get away, how we needed more weekends like this. I barely heard her. My mind was already on the next step. I had made an appointment with my lawyer for the day after we got back. The papers would be ready, and with the evidence I had, there was no way she'd get away with half of what we had. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me, not after everything she'd done. But for now, I played along. I smiled, I nodded, I acted like everything was fine. We went to bed early that night, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how this was the last time we'd ever share a bed, how this whole charade was coming to an end, and she didn't even know it. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow we hike the big trail, and when we get back, everything changes. I was ready. The hike was done. She seemed in good spirits, a little tired, but satisfied after our day on the trail. I could see it in her face. She thought this weekend was exactly what our marriage needed, a chance to reset, to bond again. But all I felt was a growing sense of distance, like I had already checked out of our life together. That night, we sat by the fire again, eating the simple dinner we'd made, but there wasn't much to say. I didn't have it in me to pretend anymore. Every word felt like a lie. She didn't notice, though. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't care enough to ask. Either way, the silence between us was heavier than it had ever been before. I stared into the fire for most of the evening, thinking about what would happen when we got home. I had rehearsed it in my mind 100 times. The confrontation, the divorce papers, how she would react when she realized I knew everything. The weight of it all sat on my chest like a brick, but there was a strange calmness too. I knew this was the right path. There was no fixing this, no saving what had already been shattered. She went to bed early, probably exhausted from the hike, and I stayed up for a while, just sitting by the fire, thinking about how we'd gotten here. When we first met, it was like a whirlwind. We clicked instantly, and I thought we had something real, something strong. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Maybe I missed the signs. Maybe I didn't want to see them. Either way, that part of my life was over now. When I finally climbed into bed, she was already asleep, curled up on her side like nothing had changed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing, and wondered how long she had been living this lie. How long she had been sharing herself with someone else while pretending to still be my wife. The anger rose again, but I pushed it down. I'd save it for when it mattered. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early. The drive home was quiet, and this time, I didn't even try to make conversation. I wasn't interested in small talk anymore. I was done pretending. I just wanted to get back, to put an end to all of this. As we pulled into our driveway, she smiled at me, like she was still riding the high from the trip. "That was great, wasn't it?" she said, her voice light, as if the last few days had erased all the distance between us. I nodded, but inside I felt cold. She had no idea that this was the last time we'd come home together. No idea that her entire world was about to collapse. I unloaded the car, walking into the house we had built together, knowing it would soon be divided. She went to take a shower, humming to herself like it was just another day. But for me, this was the moment I had been waiting for. While she was in the shower, I grabbed the folder with the divorce papers from my desk. It felt heavy in my hands, like the weight of the years we'd spent together was bound up in those pages. But I wasn't sad. Not anymore. I was ready. By the time she walked back into the living room, fresh from her shower, towel wrapped around her hair, I was sitting there with the papers on the table in front of me. She looked at me, confused, her smile fading as she saw the look on my face. "What's this?" she asked, her voice hesitant, like she already knew the answer. I took a deep breath. It was time. "We need to talk," I said. She sat down across from me, and for the first time in a long time, she looked genuinely worried. She knew something was coming, but she had no idea how bad it was going to be. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. And then, slowly, I slid the papers across the table toward her. Her eyes widened as she saw what they were. She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't going to let her get ahead of this. "I know," I said, my voice calm, steady, "about him, about everything." For a second, she just stared at me, stunned. She didn't know what to say, how to react. And then her face crumpled, and she tried to deny it, tried to act like I had it all wrong. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "I've got the recordings, the GPS. I've seen the video. You can't lie your way out of this." Her face went pale. She knew it was over. "You've got two choices," I said. "Sign the papers and walk away, or I'll take this to court and you'll lose more than just me. You won't get half of this house. You won't get half of anything." She sat there, shaking, her eyes filling with tears. But I didn't feel anything for her anymore. Not pity, not sadness. Just the cold realization that this was what had to happen. It was over. She just didn't know it yet. She didn't speak for what felt like a long time, just staring at the divorce papers in front of her. Her hands trembled as she reached for them, her eyes darting between the documents and my face. I watched her, waiting for the tears, the apologies, the excuses. But none of it mattered anymore. For a moment, I thought she might try to fight back. She was always good at talking her way out of things, convincing me that everything was fine even when I knew deep down it wasn't. But this time was different. This time, I had all the power. Finally, she found her voice. I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her words barely audible. It got out of control." I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in hearing her reasons. Whether it was out of boredom, lust, or some other excuse, the damage was done. Our marriage was dead, and nothing she said could bring it back. "You've been lying to me for months," I said, my voice steady. "You brought him into our home, into our bed. Do you even understand how far this went?" She blinked back tears, her hands gripping the papers tighter. I'm sorry," she choked out, as if that word could erase everything. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't care." I cut her off, my tone harsher than I intended. "It's too late for sorry. This is done. You need to sign those papers and leave." She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. I could see the realization setting in, that she wasn't going to talk her way out of this one, that this was the end. For the first time, she seemed truly afraid, not of me, but of what was about to happen to her life. Her voice cracked as she tried one last plea. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling or—" "No," I said firmly, "we can't. I'm not going to live like this, knowing what you've done. I've given you enough chances. I've given you years, but you threw it all away." She was shaking now, tears streaming down her face. But I didn't feel any sympathy. The love I'd once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. I wasn't the man she had married anymore, and she wasn't the woman I had built my life with. After a long pause, she nodded, finally accepting what was happening. Without another word, she reached for the pen on the table and signed the divorce papers. Her hand shook as she scrawled her name, but she did it. She knew she had no choice. When she was done, she pushed the papers back toward me. Her head hung low, as if the weight of everything had finally crashed down on her. I took the papers, glanced over them to make sure everything was in order, then stood up. "Pack your things," I said quietly. "You can take what's yours, but I want you gone by tomorrow." She didn't argue. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, wiping her eyes as she got up from the table. I watched her walk down the hall toward the bedroom, our bedroom, one last time, and I felt a strange mix of relief and finality. It was really over. The life we had built, the future we'd planned, it was all gone. I wasn't sure how I felt. Numb, maybe. A part of me thought I should be sad, that this was the moment where everything hit me. But there were no tears, no regret. Just the knowledge that I was free now. Free from the lies, the betrayal, the endless pretending. The next morning she left. I didn't say goodbye, and neither did she. She packed her car with whatever belongings she could fit and drove off without looking back. There was no dramatic scene, no last-ditch attempt to salvage anything. Just the sound of the car engine fading into the distance, leaving behind an empty driveway and an emptier house. I stood in the doorway, watching her disappear, feeling lighter than I had in months. It was strange, the silence that followed, the quietness of the house without her in it. But it wasn't a bad feeling. It felt like a new beginning. As I closed the door behind me, I realized this wasn't the end. It was just the start of something else. A life without her. A life where I could move forward without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. I sat down on the couch, the divorce papers still in my hands, and exhaled deeply. The relief washed over me like a wave. She was gone, and I was finally free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.